Hello everybody and welcome to the EAZA Animal Welfare webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name's 𝗕𝗵cie and I'm the EAZA Animal Welfare Coordinator, and we also have 𝗧𝗵cie_𝗺 from the EAZA Executive Office behind the scenes with regards to technical assistance. So if you have any problems during the Zoom, please use the chat function to contact 𝗧𝗵cie and she will make her contact details available to you there. So now I would like to pass to Thomas and say a huge thank you to 𝗕𝗵cie 𝗺 from 𝗕𝗶cie Primate Park in the Netherlands for joining us. So Thomas is a behavioural biologist who's been with 𝗕𝗶cie for about 9 years. He did his Bachelor's of Science in Biology and his Master's of Science in Behavioural Biology. His professional interests are primarily focused on primates, which is understandable, stands to reason, hence 𝗕𝗶cie Primate Park. And he's worked in everything in the zoological industry, from an educator and through to now being the zoological manager of the Knowledge and Research Department. So with that, I extend my thanks once more to you, Thomas. Thank you very much for joining us today to share your time and expertise with us. And I will pass the floor to you. If I could ask you to share your screen, that would be great. Many thanks.
Okay, there we go. Is it visible? I think so. Well, thanks, 𝗕𝗵cie, for this very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm really glad that my first talk didn't scare you off, because it was a bit odd maybe compared to the other ones. And today I'm going to give a sort of similar talk, although it will be about different aspects, of course, as well. But before I start, I would like to first say what it's not about. So I'm not talking about what animal welfare is. We have already had some great and interesting talks by Professor 𝗧𝗵cie_𝗺, for example, but also 𝗕𝗶cie his𝗱. I don't think I need to explain you why it's important for an animal perspective, so that's also something I won't be talking about a lot, maybe a little. And how to perform animal welfare assessment or quality of life assessments, because 𝗕𝗶cie already gave a great talk about that. And for those who really got interested in the stuffed bonobo who doesn't look like a bonobo, I won't be talking about the story of that animal, but in case you are interested, I can highly recommend my previous talk about this particular individual. Before I start, I would actually like to start with a video of someone else, Simon Sinek. I think it's a great video, so I'll only show you a short 4 minutes, but I can highly recommend watching the full video when you have some time. So I will be silent for 4 minutes, and hopefully you enjoy these 4 minutes.
So where do you start when you have a program that's about integrating life's passions? Well, you start with why. Why? And that kicks us off for the first speaker tonight, Simon Sinek, and his talk, Start with Why.
We assume even we know why we do what we do. But then how do you explain when things don't go as we assume? Or better, how do you explain when others are able to achieve things that seem to defy all of the assumptions? For example, why is Apple so innovative? Year after year after year after year, they're more innovative than all their competition. And yet they're just a computer company. They're just like everyone else. They have the same access to the same talent, the same agencies, the same consultants, the same media. Then why is it that they seem to have something different? Why is it that Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement? He wasn't the only man who suffered in a pre-civil rights America, and he certainly wasn't the only great orator of the day. Why him? And why is it that the Wright brothers were able to figure out controlled powered manned flight when there were certainly other teams who were better qualified, better funded, and they didn't achieve powered manned flight, and the Wright brothers beat them to it? There's something else at play here. About 3.5 years ago, I made a discovery, and this discovery profoundly changed my view on how I thought the world worked, and it even profoundly changed the way in which I operate in it. As it turns out, There's a pattern. As it turns out, all the great and inspiring leaders and organizations in the world, whether it's Apple or Martin Luther King or the Wright brothers, they all think, act, and communicate the exact same way, and it's the complete opposite to everyone else. All I did was codify it. And it's probably the world's simplest idea. I call it the golden circle. Why, how, what? This little idea explains why some organizations and some leaders are able to inspire where others aren't. Let me define the terms really quickly. Every single person, every single organization on the planet knows what they do 100%. Some know how they do it, whether you call it your differentiating value proposition or your proprietary process or your USP. But very, very few people or organizations know why they do what they do. And by why, I don't mean to make a profit. That's a result. It's always a result. By why, I mean what's your purpose? What's your cause? What's your belief? Why does your organization exist? Well, as a result, the way we think, the way we act, the way we communicate is from the outside in. It's obvious. We go from the clearest thing to the fuzziest thing. But the inspired leaders and the inspired organizations, regardless of their size, regardless of their industry, all think, act, and communicate from the inside out. Let me give you an example. I use Apple because they're easy to understand and everybody gets it. If Apple were like everyone else, a marketing message from them might sound like this. We make great computers. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one? Meh. And that's how most of us communicate. That's how most marketing is done, that's how most sales is done, and that's how most of us communicate interpersonally. We say what we do, we say how we're different or how we better, and we expect some sort of behavior, a purchase, a vote, something like that. Here's our new law firm. We have the best lawyers with the biggest clients. We have, we always perform for our clients, do business with us. Here's our new car. It gets great gas mileage. It has, leather seats. Buy our car. But it's uninspiring. Here's how Apple actually communicates. Everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. The way we challenge the status quo is by making our products beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. We just happen to make great computers. Want to buy one? Totally different, right? You're ready to buy a computer from me. All I did was
So, I think that the majority of us zoos and zoos, EAZA associated zoos, we perfectly know what our why is, right? We have great missions. Here you can see a couple of examples, and I think at least for myself, but I think also for a lot of you, the why, the reason why we're working to what we're working towards in a zoo is also the reason why I like to work in a zoo. And as you can see, I just gave a couple of examples, random examples, just one that popped up first in Google. And you can see they all share a lot of similar words, whether it's saving species, preventing extinction, conservation, education, inspiring visitors. I think we are really, really good in understanding why we are doing the things. And also the what is very visible. We are zoo organizations, we have animals, and well, this is what we're doing. In this talk, I would really like to focus on the how, because we perfectly know, like I said, what our why is. And sometimes I have the feeling that we don't always know how we do it. And hopefully this talk will at least give you some examples and some tools to start working on it how as well. Of course, you know how to do it, but maybe with respect to animal welfare, there's still still a lot to gain. And obviously, there's a strong interconnection between the why and the how. That's also why 𝗧𝗵cie made it really in a golden circle, that the why is within the how. And I think that if we were a zoo and we would start making money, if that was our goal, making profit as a result, we could do a lot of other things. We could let visitors milk bottle feed cute chimpanzees, or we could breed every animal and sell it on the market, right? There's a very good market for trading animals, so we could make a lot of money, but that's obviously not the reason why we are working in a zoo, and that's also not what we're working towards. Working towards education, research, conservation, all the important, the most important things that are listed here in this very well-designed graph. So, for example, I already gave some examples in my previous talk about education. If we would like to teach children and visitors about animals, and we show an animal that's constantly pacing or performing 𝗕𝗵cie or other types of abnormal behavior, what are we actually teaching them? Is that what we would like to achieve? I don't think so. And the same accounts for conservation. If we have animals that are not performing species-specific and appropriate behavior, and we say that our goal is to have an insurance population or to restock them, ultimately maybe even in the wild, it can only be done if we have animals that are behaving, that are regarding behavior and their mental state in good conditions, right? And the same accounts for research, of course. If we are doing research and our animals are performing in such a way that it's not normal anymore, what's the value of the research and the data that you're collecting? So for me, animal welfare is the foundation actually of what we're doing, and sustainability is often overlooked. Very important as well, I think, but I won't be talking about that one this talk. So animal welfare is the foundation. If we don't take proper care of our animals, if we don't strive for the highest standards of animal welfare, then all these beautiful pillars of the modern progressive zoo, this is what will happen if you remove the foundation. They will be destroyed. And personally, for my personal belief, if you don't take good care of animals, then even something like species conservation in the wild, it's something that my heart makes my heart beat faster. It's something I really value. But of course, there is a boundary. If it's really only possible with poor animal welfare conditions, then I still wouldn't. So for me, that's very important. But it's not only for me, for myself, but also for us as a mission. So if the animal welfare is not okay, we won't be achieving the impact and the mission that we are striving for. So it's very essential. And lastly, and I don't want to sound like a preacher, although I am a bit of preaching now, I think it's also for our visitors. We have a moral obligation. They pay money to view our animals, and they trust that the animals that we keep are in good care and we take good care of them. So that is very important. So from multiple perspectives, animal welfare is the essential part. But of course, we know a lot already about animals and how to keep them, but we also have a lot of challenges. First of all is, for example, space. And obviously, there are differences between countries. And for example, I'm from the Netherlands, which is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, based on square kilometers. So space is always an issue. And we all know that, for example, enclosure size is an important factor for animal welfare. And of course, the volume, the dynamics, how you shape the enclosure is also very important. But without space, you can't have any animals. So that's very a limiting factor. And time, of course, is also very important. I think the most of you will it will sound really familiar that at the end of the week you still have the feeling that you haven't done enough, and that you at least would like to have twice the time that you have to do all the things that you find are important. Because at least in my belief, all the things that I would like to do are important, are interesting, and we are forced to make choices. So we can, of course, start to work 80 or 100 hours a week, but then we won't have a social or family life. And my son, for example, for him, finishing the Lego building is maybe even more important than do the things I do at work. And by the way, that's not my son on the picture. He's still a lot younger, but you get the idea. And lastly, of course, money or funding, it's always limiting. We are trying our best, but in my institution, for example, we are solely dependent on our revenues from visitors. We don't get any subsidy from the government or local government or whatsoever. And we always have to be really critical on what can we do based on our financial limitations. So these are three challenges, and obviously there are more challenges, but I would like to highlight these because these are always returning challenges. So for me, the greatest challenge in general is how can we realize our great ideas? Because I'm sure you have perfect ideas and know what you would like to do with certain animals, enclosures, or policy, animal welfare assessment. So how can we realize them and make them bring them in practice instead of only thinking and mentioning about it or feeling maybe a bit disappointed at the end of the week that we still didn't found a way to achieve it. So for me, it all starts with the way we talk about it. It really influences how it's being regarded. So for example, with animal welfare assessments, I'm using this example because it's something that is becoming more and more used in EAZA zoos. Some do it already for years, some are just starting. We have started last year in the Netherlands. And yeah, it takes a lot of time. On the other end, you can also describe it as it's an essential part from an animal perspective and from our mission perspective. As I said before, it is the foundation, I think, of the work that we do. And if you want to create impact, we have to make sure. So already, I know maybe it's a bit nuanced, but I think that's already really important. Yes, it takes time, but so do job interviews, so do maintenance, so do creating workspace, whatever. Everything takes time, and we always have to make choices because we are limited in time. But this is a really important part. So I think we should see it as more like a benefit, because it can bring us a lot, not only us, but also the animals, the visitors, and eventually the impact. So if we start approaching it more as a benefit or an opportunity and not as a cost, it will already make a huge difference. And now, again, I sound like a preacher, and if I was a preacher, then it would be a great time to thank you for your attention and leave. But of course, you are zoo professionals and scientists, and you have a critical attitude. So at least there must be someone listening now who is thinking, well, yeah, good story, monkey boy, but how can you do that? So Sally, I'm gonna try and explain how to do it. But first, before I can do it, you need to I would like to shortly explain a very simplistic way of thinking, which is often used in management jobs. Because what I get back from people is that, well, yeah, we find it really important, but my manager says we don't have the time for it to do it. So that's the reason that stops us from doing, for example, welfare assessments. And I'm absolutely not saying that the zoo animal managers do not value animal welfare, or that they're not working towards the mission. Of course they do. They formulate a mission, and it would be really weird if they do not support it. But at the same time, they have a very they have to make choices all day. Their first and main priority is also to keep a healthy organization, because if you're going if the organization is going down because there's lack of funding or whatever, then there's no animal welfare at all. So they have to make choices all the time. But I would like to show a very simplistic example with animal welfare examples. So there's always a balance between a cost and a benefit. And in this particular example, doing animal welfare assessments, it costs time, right? It requires staff hours, whether it's 2 hours or 20 hours, whether it's once a year or once every 5 years, doesn't matter, it takes time. And also the outcome of the assessment might also induce, for example, additional funding or an investment, because you need to change something with respect to animal welfare, adding another enclosure for adding complexity or just more space. While on the other hand, you have, of course, the benefits, and one could be that you achieve higher animal welfare or increased knowledge of the species, because you talk about it in a group, or you start reading some more literature about it. But the difference between obviously there are more costs and there are more benefits, but just for the sake of the presentation, I'll try to keep it simple. The costs are very measurable. Time investment, just X number of hours, costs so much money, really measurable. Outcome, also, if it needs to be an investment, that's really easy to label it with a certain price. While on the other hand, the benefits, higher animal welfare, it's not that measurable. It doesn't add money, not directly at least, or the same accounts for increased knowledge. What does it really? What is really the increase, and how can you measure it? So from a management perspective, you're talking about costs that are very measurable and visible, while on the benefits are not really measurable or visible. So for me, I think the challenges that we need to face is how can we make that benefit or the opportunities that we see more measurable and more visible. That I think it really helps from a management perspective to make choices, because we need to make choices, and sometimes choices need to be made that don't increase animal welfare, for example. And that doesn't mean that it's not valued, but it's just making choices. You have to eventually. So how do you do it? I just want to talk a little bit about animal welfare assessments, because we've just started it in the 𝗕𝗵cie organization. And before you know what you are measuring, you need to, of course, have a definition. And this is the one that we came up with. So high or positive animal welfare can be achieved when an animal is provided with sufficient freedom to be able to adapt to both internal and external factors by performing species-specific behavior, and as a result can achieve a positive mental state. Really a mouthful, and really easy to measure, right? No, that's not really easy to measure. It's not impossible. I did look for a book on the internet who claimed that they could measure everything, but animal welfare wasn't in there. So we needed to design our own assessment. And this is how we did it. So we did it in all the Dutch zoos associated with the Dutch Zoo organization. 𝗧𝗵cie, who is my colleague at 𝗕𝗶elle, she was the supervisor of this project, and we did it in close cooperation with many of my colleagues from Dutch zoos. And it was based on the EAZA Animal Welfare Toolkit. So for those of you who haven't seen it yet, it's on the EAZA page. There's a whole bunch of different animal welfare assessments. One take a long time, others are really easy and short, and we chose this one as the foundation of the ones that we expanded. And so having a definition and doing assessments is the first and important step in making this animal welfare more measurable. So how do we do it in practice? Well, we have a multidisciplinary team with experts. Caretakers are always involved because, yes, I'm a behavioral biologist, but the caretakers know a lot more about the animals than I do. They work with them on a daily basis, so they're vital to be in this group. But you can also add a veterinarian or a curator, or even for certain specific nutrition component aspects, you can ask your nutritionist if you have it. But at least it needs to be at least 2 people, preferably more, that will fill out the questionnaire. Currently, the questionnaire consists of 91 questions, and it's divided in animal behavior and health, and more environmental aspects such as nutrition, the enclosure size, space, etc. And I can imagine that if you see 91 questions, it's only for one species and actually for one particular individual. It is quite a lot. And I agree, it is a lot. But if you want to know a lot about how an animal is doing, then of course you also need to ask a lot of questions. And likely this number of questions will reduce if we can make the questionnaires more species specific. So for example, if you would do an animal welfare assessment on fish, and you would do the same on primates, for example, certain aspects are not very relevant for a primate, and vice versa. Some aspects that are important for a primate are not important for fish. So every question is being scored on a 3-point scale, which is easy, but it also forces you to make a sort of strong choice. So either you scored with yes, it's 1 point, or somewhat, which is half a point, or no, and it's 0. And then ultimately there's a figure at the end that says, well, an individual scores this amount of points, but you need to be cautious with that, because you can score on multiple ways. So you can score half on the questions yes and the other one no, or you can score all the questions 0.5 and you have the same score, but you have a total different outcome. But that is something different. So how we continue is in the same group that did all the assessments. We come together, and only coming together and discuss the questions and the answers is already very valuable in itself, because it really facilitates discussion, not only at that moment, but also afterwards among keepers, for example. And ultimately, it would lead to one scoring for that particular individual. And then we have measured the animal welfare of that particular individual. But obviously, that is not where it ends. Actually, it's only the start, because there's no use in measuring something and not acting accordingly. So we made, after that, we are making we call it an animal welfare action plan, which is a really interesting acronym, at least in English, because when I Googled it, this book came up, All Women Are Psychotic, written by two men, of course, but in Dutch, at least, we have a different acronym, and it's called the DAP, Dierenwelzijn, which means Animal Welfare Action Plan. And that's what we're using. And for us, it's very valuable, because to give a concrete example, we started with ring-tailed lemurs because it's the most common primate in zoos. And from the 13 associated zoos, 12 have this species as well. So we're all looking at the same animals. And to give a simple outcome, the fur condition of lemurs has a strong relation with air humidity, and of course a lot more, but this is an important one. And we found actually that we are measuring air humidity, but not on a constant basis, because we had a tool for it, but it wasn't one that was always present. So very simple, very concrete output. We just would buy an air humidity meter, hang it up, and daily record the air humidity temperature. So that was really easy, and obviously it's not always that easy and concrete. But at least you make it visible. So that's what we are really achieving. It's noted down. It's something that we can work towards, sometimes in the short, sometimes in the long term. But for us, it's really concrete action points that we use, for example, for our year plan. Every year we make a plan, what are we going to do, what's it going to cost, and the output of these animal welfare action plans really are the basis of what we are working towards. Very yeah, it costs time, but it can help out a lot. And that is, of course, the biggest challenge is how can you still make this feasible. But I think if you start already by doing this, and if you already focus on those points, it can already be beneficial for whether it is lower veterinary costs, or you have better idea of what you're working towards and what you need for it. So that's, for us, it's really helping already. So something different, but very important for the how is the institutional collection planning, and because we know our why and we know our how, but the what is more about what animals are we keeping. And for me, the central question here is that we need to ask is, what species do we keep, and even more important, why do we keep them? Because we are luckily far away from the whole collector's idea that we just keeping animals for our collection and we show them to people or to brag with. We need to explain why we have the animals, and I think we need to ask that question. But even if you are not intrinsically motivated to ask that question, if you still would like to keep animals just for the sake of keeping, then I still would encourage you to ask the question, because ultimately the question will be asked, and whether it is by yourself or by the outside world, by activists or by even government or so, you need to have an answer. Why do you keep the animals that you keep? And the interesting thing is, it's pretty obviously right, that if you keep animals, that you at least know why you have those animals. Because for me, it really helps us in working towards the impact of our mission. So all the animals we have need to at least be partly working towards an increased impact in our mission. So we ask the same question. And when I started working on this, I was also asking colleagues from other zoos. So how do you, what's your methodology behind your institutional collection plan? Do you have a collection plan, and how does it look like? And these are a couple of the answers that I got from people. So yeah, we have one person, and he decides, or he or she decides, what kind of animals do we take, or I have no idea actually, or I think it's based on availability and what visitors like, but at least there's a large part of subjectivity involved in here, and that's what I think it's a bit scary. For example, apart from primates, I also really like reptiles, for example, and let's say I'm responsible for the institutional collection planning in 𝗕𝗵cie, and because I happen to like crocodiles or alligators or both, I come up with the guys, we need to keep, we start keeping crocodiles in a primate park. It doesn't make sense at all, but yeah, I'm that one person who decides what to do, and suddenly you end up with crocodiles in a primate park. I don't think that's the way it should work. So therefore we have designed a sort of a methodology to prevent that subjectivity and to make it more objective. Because otherwise, if I change position and someone else comes after me and he just happened to like, I don't know, tigers or large carnivores, then suddenly you have a large carnivore without the proper knowledge or space or enclosure or whatever. So every animal that we have or that we would like to have is being scored by these 4 points. So the first one is educational point. There's no hierarchy between the orders. There's no different weighing, all weigh more or less the same. And I know maybe there are some educators listening as well. Of course, for every single individual, you can have a lot of interesting information that you can share with your visitors. But obviously, some stories that we tell about our animals are more attractive for visitors or are more interesting to listen to than others. So the educational value, while recognizing that it is subjective, it is something that we take into account. For example, the gorilla, it's the biggest of all primates. That itself is already a good educational story. And it goes much deeper than that, of course, but you get the idea. So the other one is really objective. That's the IUCN status. So we look at we just look at the IUCN status and score it. So whether an animal is not threatened or critically endangered or extinct in the wild, that the whole scope we take into account. And the other two are attractiveness. Of course, we keep animals for our mission, but we are also dependent on our visitors. So it would be a bit too naive, I think, to totally disregard the attractiveness, because we can have lots of grayish, not so attractive primates that are endangered, but I think likely we can close our doors within a couple of years. So you need to have animals that bring people in, and hopefully, and ideally, it will also be with high scorings on, for example, the IUCN status and education. And lastly, and that's why it's important for this talk, is do the animals match our philosophy? So our philosophy is that we try and keep our animals in the most natural conditions as possible, which is of course based on what we can provide, but also can we provide them with what we call the 9+ experience. And 9+ is you can also call it A+, but we try to achieve the highest standard of animal welfare. And if we don't think we can reach that or achieve that, then it's something that we already take into account in our current collection, but also in the animals that we would like to add. So very simple, you score every one of the 4 factors from 1 to 5. 1 is low, 5 is high, and then you get a scoring. So for example, with the stuffed animal, again, educational value is low because it doesn't really look like a bonobo. He's critically endangered or even extinct in the wild, so he scores very high. It's not that attractive, and it doesn't match our philosophy at all. So this particular animal would achieve a low score and would be either, if we have it in the collection, would be probably some one that we would phase out, or we would not start with the animal in the first place. But it's not that the score itself does automatically result in whether we keep it or we phase it out, but it's a start of the discussion. So at least you get a lot more open and focused discussion and try and prevent as much subjectivity as possible. Yeah, so here this is really for us really important. So can we actually, what we are doing with respect to animal welfare, we already do it at the gates. So before we get into any welfare related issues or challenges, we already see on beforehand if we can provide that what we think that that is required. So again, if I come with my great idea to start with crocodiles in 𝗕𝗶cie, then during that discussion that we have with the curator, for example, or the head keepers or the management team, so why would you like to see crocodiles in 𝗕𝗶cie? Why do you think it's an addition? And then maybe with a lot of creativity, I can convince them that it's really necessary. For example, because, well, there is one particular primate that shares the habitat with a crocodile, and therefore that's a great story that we could tell. You need to be very persuasive to do so, but then we still have other questions. So, well, do we have the proper knowledge to take care of crocodiles? And do we have the space? Can we create that 9+ experience from the animal perspective? So all these questions are being asked and discussed, and then we decide whether we start or don't start with animals. But we also do it with our current collection, because obviously, if you see the points, the ICN status, for example, it can change. Animals can go from near threatened to critically endangered, and it also changes the score. So it's something that we regularly do at least once a year. Yeah, this is what I said. So by adding animal welfare as a key component of our animal collection planning, you can already avoid these potential animal welfare related issues from the start. Then I would like to continue about the EAZA population management strategy, because as you know, our why is more or less conserving animal species, education, all the things that we have mentioned before. And I think EAZA, as a community, we have already made a really great step forward in adopting the new population management strategy, which is based about these 3 pillars. I won't go into much detail, but there's the regional collection plan, which is sort of an overall view of a certain a taxon, where you decide, well, this species is something that we need to keep in EAZA zoos, and this one we should phase out for various reasons. You got, of course, the breeding program, and then the long-term management plan. And the reason why I really liked it, and maybe I'm a bit biased because there is, I think, a lot of overlap with our own system that we adopt in our zoo with respect to collection planning, but it's the role identification. So for every species that has an EP, there are 1 or multiple roles for that specific EP. So actually the why do we keep these species there? And it can be, there are various reasons. So it can be for restocking wild population, which is a very direct effect on conservation. But you can also have, for example, education awareness, which is indirect, but also can be really, really important. And I happen to be involved in the gorilla long-term management planning just this week, which took us 2 whole days. Very interesting and fruitful 2 days, but also quite time-consuming. But again, very important. So that's what we need to do. But this really is an important factor, I think, for us as a zoo community. So what I find, again, very interesting, and also what made me think about when this was implemented. So if we are saying that we're having this species for a specific role, and again, for example, for restocking the wild population or for education awareness, what does this mean for our way of keeping them? Does it changes the way that we need to keep them? For example, if you would like to restock a wild population, apart from the fact that they need to be behavioral and mentally healthy, you would also like them to maybe avoid people more or less, or avoid all the direct contact with keepers and visitors. While on the other hand, if the main goal or role for this particular species is education, what does it mean in housing them? Maybe you need to put them in a certain spot in the zoo where you know there are a lot of people passing by, or you should invest in a huge education exhibit, because that's the central role. So there are various ways of thinking about how to house the animals, that is appropriate for the role that they have from an EP perspective. And this also made me really think about how does this compare between the different species? For example, the species that are not threatened in the wild, but that we keep, compared to, for example, the critically endangered species. Because if you follow my talk from the start, then I think every animal should receive the highest quality of animal care, right? I think we all agree. But what if you argue the other way around? And again, here you see my fantastic Photoshop or Microsoft Paint qualities, but don't look at how it looks, but more at the things that I mentioned. So this is a hypothetical example, or how it can work, and what makes me at least think about how we regard the animals that we have and how we keep them. So here on the horizontal axis, you got threatened, non-threatened, and here critically endangered. So it's a scale. And on the y-axis, you got the low welfare and high welfare. So I think 10, 20 years ago, we were really focusing on minimizing negative welfare. So this is the bar. So we were focusing here. As long as the 5-domain model, for example, from Bambo, was really avoiding negative things, whether it is thirst or hunger or pain. Avoid suffering, and then we are achieving. Now we are making a very good step towards enhancing positive welfare, which is this upper level. So if you compare, for example, an animal that is not threatened, no, what I try to say is that for every animal, we would like to achieve this graph, the highest welfare, right? That's a goal. It's hypothetical, it's not always possible, but it's what we are working towards. But what happens if, for example, an endangered species, which probably has an important conservation role, but we don't know yet, or we are not good at keeping that animal. So the welfare is, for example, somewhere here in the middle, or perhaps even lower. What does that mean? Does it justify the conservation value that that particular species has? Does it allow us to accept that he has a reduced welfare or not? I think it's very interesting to think about it. First of all, from a hypothetical perspective, but obviously we need to really start thinking about our own animals. And of course, this field is more animal ethics. But I think it's very important to think about it. What does it mean if we assign a certain role? What does it mean for us keeping that species? And what if we are not yet capable of reaching that high standards of welfare? Of course, we should work towards it, but what if at some point we come to the conclusion that we aren't able to achieve that? How do you continue with the species? So sometimes animal welfare and the conservation value can be in conflict with each other. And what's more important, that's something I think not for now, but I would encourage you and invite you to really think about it. And yeah, looking forward to hear what you think. Because this is very important, the breeding programs. That's, of course, you all know why we breed and why it's important. And often what you hear is that, of course, within the breeding programs that we are breeding for example, for a high genetic viable population. It's very important that we prevent inbreeding and that we keep as much genetic diversity as possible. But also from a demography perspective, you would like to have a stable population with a nice pyramid shape. But we have been so, our knowledge about keeping animals and how to take care of them has increased so much that we have become maybe a sort of a victim of our own success, because the majority of the animals that we keep become much older than they would in the wild. Especially for males. Males tend to die younger in the wild. For example, there are certain primate species where the 50% of the males don't even reach maturity because they died because of conflicts or predators or whatever. Of course, this doesn't happen in zoos, and the consequence is that, for example, in male, we have surplus males. And if you ask people, but why do we continue breeding? Then apart from the whole genetic demography answers, many people will also argue that, of course, we keep them we breed with them because it's good for the animal welfare. And I'm a biologist, and my gut feeling says the same. You could easily argue that, well, animals are programmed, instinctively motivated to reproduce. That's a result of the whole natural selection, because if it wasn't there, then species would die out easily. Actually, yeah, I'm really curious about what you think. We have more than 100 people in the room, so it would be really interesting to hear your ideas. So, of course, I'm not used. I wanted to present the example of the praying mantis. I think for the male, it doesn't have a significant positive influence. So that this is a question that is really easy to ask, but obviously it's much more nuanced. So I'm not talking about animals that need to breed from, for example, a health perspective. Elephants, for example, if the females don't get pregnant every 8 years or so, then they become infertile. So I'm really talking about, and I'm not talking about extensive breeding as in the commercial pig farms, for example, but natural breeding in a normal pace. Do you think it has a significant positive influence on the animal welfare? And you can add both the individual or the group. So thank you, Sandrine. We have a poll. Hopefully you see it and you can just answer yes or no. I think we'll take about 1 minute or until we're finished. Okay, I can share the results. I hope you guys see it. So that's pretty obvious, right? So 85% thinks that it has a significant positive impact on the animal welfare. And I would agree, at least I used to agree with a full yes, and now I have my doubts. And therefore I would like to ask another question. How many of you guys have read or know of any scientific papers or evidence that really substantiate this claim that we make, that we really think it's has a positive impact? Okay, well, it's almost the opposite score. I'll share the results again with you guys. So 82% does make this claim probably. Maybe it's a bit less, but the majority of you guys think that you think it has a significant positive influence, but we haven't read any paper or evidence. And if I ask, for example, my colleague keepers, then the majority says, yeah, it's very important for the dynamics. And I'm not disregarding their experience or their observations, but I think if, like I said, breeding comes with a cost because we are so good at it, and we don't, for example, apply the same mortality rates that are in the wild. So for me, it was really interesting to come to this, to ask this question myself. Okay, but if it's true, and majority of my colleagues are saying the same, then there must be evidence, right? That it must have been looked at something. And still, there are 15 people who have read any scientific papers or evidence. So all the 15 persons, I would really invite you to share the papers with me or the evidence, because so far, to my knowledge, there's only one paper which has been published in 2016, and they looked at the relation. And of course, there always with science there are lots of bits and ifs, and requires additional research. But based on this research, they didn't see any evidence for a significant positive influence. And yeah, I'm a father of 2 sons, and I love them to death, obviously, but it comes at a cost as well. So I can also argue the other way around, and I'm not being too anthropomorphic, and it can of course change for animals. But I think it just really shows a huge gap in our knowledge about breeding and animal welfare. So I think it's very important that we, as a community maybe, or for the EAZA research committee, really start to look into this gap. And I'm looking for people that would like to collaborate or already performing research on this topic, because it's very important. So yeah, thanks for everybody participating in the poll. For me, it was really interesting. And this also brings me to the end of my talk. Just some concluding remarks. for me, again, animal welfare is such an important part of what we're doing. It's the foundation of what we do. It's so important for our mission and the impact, for our why, for what we're trying to achieve. And I think to approach it as a benefit and opportunity, not as a cost, can help us a lot, and can really help the impact that we are trying to achieve. Apart from the moral obligation that I was also preaching about. And finally, we really need to know why we keep the species and what this means. And also, I forgot to mention, but also, why are we breeding and what are the consequences? How important is it for the animal welfare? And does it differ per species, or per age, or per sex even, perhaps? Oh, of course, this takes years to research, but I think we should really at least start with it, because, like I said, if there's one or maybe more papers, the maximum may be 16, because 15 people know of something. But again, this is vital information, I think, for us, for our future, for our breeding programs, and eventually for what we are trying to achieve. So yeah, thank you all for listening, and hopefully you have enjoyed it. And also, I hope to have at least sparked a little bit of your brain, and that you also start thinking about these things. And please feel free to share me. My email is at the opening page of my presentation, so feel free to contact me. And of course, we still have space for some questions, I think. So yeah, thank you for your attention, and thanks, Sally, for having me here.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you. These polls are really interesting, really interesting. Thank you. So we do have a number of questions. I apologise now if we don't get round to everybody's, but we will start with Gavin. Gavin has a question regarding welfare assessments and actioning. Gavin, if I can ask you to unmute yourself, please.
How do you take the information? How do you take the information from the assessments that you do for welfare and use it to help the animal?
How do we, sorry, I couldn't hear, but how do we use the information that is derived from the animal welfare assessment to help the animals? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to explain. So we have this animal welfare action plan. So all the things that we measure, and then we are focusing, of course, on the questions that are answered by a no or a somewhat. That for us, that is something that we can improve. So we make a whole list, and which is it can be quite a long list with all the things that we would like to work on, and then based on what it actually is, we make a list of priorities, because we can't do obviously everything. So you need to make choices whether you can do it at this time already. Maybe it's just a daily routine that we need to change. And sometimes it's redesigning the whole enclosure, for example. And obviously that is something that we need to be doing in the future if we have sufficient funding, for example.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Gavin. And if I could now hand to Paul Rose, if you could unmute yourself, please, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Thanks, Thomas. Really nice talk. I had a question about the collection planning that you talked about, and the attractiveness and the educational relevance of the species that you were thinking about. And I just wondered if you'd considered familiarity of the species as well. So, for example, how familiar a species is, that's going to influence how much people care or empathise with it. So is that something that you're also taking into account, like the familiarity of animals in the zoo?
A good question, Paul. One question for you. Do you mean familiarity from us as a human towards, for example, a primate, or how often the primate is seen in zoos and that type of familiarity?
Yeah. So like, how familiar is that species to the people that are kind of watching it? Like, not how commonly does it occur, but is it something that people seem to be familiar with?
No, actually we don't. It's an interesting question, because we sometimes have the discussion in our zoo, because we are a specialized primate park. We would like to have also other types of primates that are not as common as in other zoos. So I think it's more the other way around, then that we're really looking for species that are common in other zoos as well. But of course, the number of species that we can have in zoos is limited, and especially for primates. So it is in most cases it's somewhere visible, but it's not something that we take into account. But it's an interesting question to think about. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have a question now from Borja. Borja, if I could ask you to unmute, please.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for sharing such valuable information. My question is regarding the value when you mentioned about the institutional collection planning, and in regards of have you considered research value as a criterion for the institutional collection planning? I'm referring to analog species and conservation-related research species. I'm asking because this is often included in the conservation value, but I'm not sure if in your case this applies.
No, again, good question and interesting. No, it's not something that we take into account in our institutional collection planning. However, the role identification that is now taking place within the EAZA population management strategy, that is something that we take into account. So, for example, with the gorillas, last week we discussed it that gorillas ex situ can sometimes be really easily used as a sort of a test case for ex situ or for in situ research types, whether it is camera traps or maybe collars or whatever. So that is not something that we take into account in the collection planning, but it is something that we try to incorporate because of the role identification from the long-term management plan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have one last question that somebody has asked me to ask on their behalf. And they said, how do you address pushback in your institution from people who don't consider welfare as a fundamental consideration for collection planning? I think more kind of along the human behaviour change line.
Sorry, how do we?
It says, they said, how do you address pushback? So how do you address kind of lack of acceptance in your institution from people who don't consider welfare as a fundamental consideration for collection planning?
That's yeah. That's, I think it's there, but it's like with normal working businesses like it. So you start to talk about it, right? So if people, we have keepers that have been working with us for 40 years, so they started from a different perspective, and obviously our mission has been the same as 50 years ago. Next year we celebrate our 50-year anniversary, but the way that we look at animal welfare can differ between the 1970s and the 2020s that we're in now. But for me, it always starts with talking about it, discussing it, and not discussing it to convince someone from your own opinion, but really listening to themselves, because otherwise you're just trying to overrule someone and it doesn't really bring you further. But it's such, at least in my institution, it's such a core business. So if it's not only the zoo or the animal people that find it important, also our online marketeer really values animal welfare. So I think it's in our DNA, and there are not many people that that are not going in the same direction as we would like to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And apologies to those I didn't get to with regards to questions, but we have run out of time. A huge thank you to you, Thomas, for sharing all your knowledge. Some really, really interesting ideas in there I think a lot of people are going to be thinking about for a while. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, sure. You're most welcome.
Thank you. If I could just ask you to unshare your screen for me, please, Thomas.
Yeah, sure.
And thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. I hope you found that really useful and interesting. As I said at the start, that will be available to you via the EAZA YouTube channel. And you can find that advertised via the EAZA Animal Welfare Facebook group. So if you're not a member of that already, please do join. We share lots of papers and ideas from the zoological community to improve animal welfare from an evidence-based perspective. And as I said, there is also on our EAZA website animal welfare page all the previous webinars for you to view at your own pleasure, and also many animal welfare assessments. And we also have the Wild Planet Trust Assessment, which has been translated into 14 languages, and that's all freely available for you to download, so please do check that out. Regarding our next webinar, please again have a look on the EAZA EAZA website, and there's a list of some forthcoming webinars which will be opening normally about a month beforehand. So we hope you'll be able to join us for those. We thank you very much for your time today. Once again, thank you very much to Thomas, and thank you to Sandrine behind the scenes, and we hope you'll be able to join us next time. Many thanks.